one of our intensive English program teachers, Joy Foster-Steckler. So hello, Joy.
Hi.
How are you today? Good.
Good.
So Joy has been teaching with our IEP for a long time. And before that, she actually taught ESL in the Milwaukee Public Schools. And we're going to get into that just a little bit today. But first, Joy, I want to ask you, how long have you been with the English Language Academy?
6.5 years.
Yeah, so that's a decent amount of time.
Yes.
And how have you liked it so far?
I love it. I love my students. I love who I work with.
Yeah. Great.
Yes.
And like I said, you worked for Milwaukee Public Schools as an ESL teacher before then.
Yes.
Now, I don't remember, were you teaching high schoolers or middle schoolers or
High school.
Okay. Yeah. So how did your teaching differ teaching in public schools and a public high school than it does teaching university students now?
Well, the biggest difference is the backgrounds of the students that I worked with in the high school. I had a variety of students in one class of different ages, maybe from 15 all the way up to 21 sometimes. And the majority were immigrants and refugees, and there were some U.S. citizens, which means from either parents from Mexico, but the students were born here, or from Puerto Rico, because anybody from Puerto Rico is a citizen.
Yes.
And the other big difference is that a lot of the students at that school were economically disadvantaged, and that maybe their families came here for better opportunities, work, that kind of thing. And you know, of course, if they're refugees, they came for other reasons. So a lot of the students had struggles sometimes because there were psychological issues of learning the new culture that a lot of our students go through. But on top of that, their families were trying to adjust, and a lot of times their parents did not speak English. And so my students were sometimes acting as adults because their parents couldn't, maybe at a clinic or, you know, any kind of situation like that.
Yeah.
And because the majority were teenagers, there was a different kind of energy level in class. I had some students who were very immature because they were very young.
Yeah.
And I had other students who were definitely more mature. And sometimes they were mixed together because our classes were not according to grade level, but how much English they knew.
Right. And that makes sense.
Yeah.
Wow. So lots of differences. Not ones you would think right away, but definitely because our students are older and generally more mature and come from other countries, and they're not necessarily residents. What did you find to be the most complicated difference in having to alter how you were teaching our students as opposed to those students in the high schools?
Adjusting to UWM's population? Is that what you mean? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, in the high school, I had a lot of students who did not have educational opportunities in their countries. Maybe there was a war, for example, in El Salvador, or maybe their education was interrupted, like in El Salvador, or in Iraq, or some places students might have been in refugee camps and there wasn't always education available. So I never assumed that my students knew background information. For example, we were going to talk about space, and we were going to talk about space exploration. And first, I had to ask if they knew the planets. And believe it or not, some of my first students that came from Southeast Asia had not had any of this ever told to them in any kind of setting. And my translator, who would explain certain content information, said that they didn't believe him that there were planets. Okay, so
Oh, wow.
yeah, so they were learning a lot of that. However, I had some other students that were highly educated in their home countries. So when I got to UWM, it was a really big difference because I would normally assume that my students knew these things. I mean, I might ask a couple questions to check, but generally they knew all of the background.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So that definitely you probably had to do more background teaching in the high school than you maybe do with our students. Is that how I'm understanding it?
Is correct. And I do not have to spend a lot of time in my intensive English program classes disciplining students because they have a certain maturity level and their attention spans are like adult attention spans most of the time. Whereas in the other situation, sometimes they wouldn't sit there real, quietly. They would chatter away.
Yeah. Would you say that's why you changed over?
No. I left because it's a long story, but it has to do with insurance and something that was happening in the state of Wisconsin. There was a decision made that was going to drastically change insurance that teachers receive as part of their benefits. It was always part of our pay was to have good benefits like insurance. And so the leaders of the teacher union advised all the teachers who could, because of our age, to take early retirement. So that's what many of us did. And I wasn't ready to stop teaching, which is why I got the job at UWM about 3 months later.
Okay. So definitely there were some extra things outside of that changed. But that's okay because we have you now.
Yeah.
So that's awesome.
Yeah.
So clearly you love teaching because you've been doing it for a long time. So what is a subject that you would say you love teaching or to use in a thematic unit while you're teaching?
There are so many units I've created. Just one that comes to mind is using a movie called Fly Away Home. And there are different things that we've talked about or written about, and that is animal migration and family relationships and how somebody can grow as a person as she's getting older. So the most exciting thing is a father taught his daughter how to fly an experiment, not experimental, but it's a plane called an ultralight. And the reason he taught her how to do that is she found some eggs that were abandoned by their mother. And the eggs opened, and she became very attached to these birds. And because they didn't have a mother to show them how to migrate south when it got cold in Canada, she and her father decided to try to show them how to get there. And it's based on some things that have really happened of people showing these birds how to migrate.
I watched that as a kid because that sounds extremely familiar.
It's a really great movie, and the girl really grows up in the process, and her relationship with her father changes, and it's a beautiful story.
That's nice. I like that. But you love using that movie.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you find that students love it too?
Oh, yes. And there's beautiful photography.
I'll have to watch again. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I watched that as a kid because that sounds extremely familiar to me. So you might have to hunt it down and watch it again. Cool. That's awesome. So then what do you love most about teaching ESL, especially with our students?
I love seeing them learn more English in order to achieve their goals. It might be a personal goal, it might be an academic goal, or it might be for someone's career. And I like seeing how their skills develop and usually how confident they become. I really like helping people do that.
Yeah, I love doing that too. And I think that's probably the most important thing when, I've taught to, I think it's just as important to focus on like the personal growth as like people and not just like on the language growth.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, for sure. Well, then, of course, teaching also comes with its challenges, right? We both know that very well. So what would you say is one of the biggest challenges of teaching?
I think that one of the biggest challenges is when students are not motivated to learn. There can be many reasons for this. It could be their families don't really have high expectations that they're going to learn more than the basics of education. And so they don't feel any reason. They think they're just going to get a job and they don't really need to study. Or it could be maybe somebody else wants them to learn, maybe family members or something, and they don't really have investment. They're not interested, or it could be other things are happening in their lives, and they just maybe can't focus. But now that we're teaching online, that's a different story.
Yes.
One of the most difficult things is not being able to get up and move around like we do sometimes, and when we have connection problems. And I know students and I get frustrated with that, but we do the best we can.
Yeah, for sure.
How about you? Do you have a frustration? What's the hardest thing for you?
For teaching?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it would definitely be the motivation, especially because even so I've taught both French and ESL to university students. And I think I saw this more with my French students, but I definitely saw it with some of my ESL students too. And of course it's motivation, but I think it's this like when the underlying factor of this motivation is that they think that they're never going to be good enough.
Yeah.
So like they just don't try. Like their fear of failure makes them stop trying. Like they're like, oh, like I'm going to say the wrong word, or I'm going to say not use the correct verb tense. And I think that's the hardest like motivating factor to overcome, because if they're convinced that they're a failure, then they're just not even going to try. And so something I love to do with my students is like openly admit when I make a mistake. And at least it shows them like it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay because that's how you learn and grow. And like even me, like English is my native language and I still mess it up, or even French. Like I've been learning / speaking French for 15 years. And there are still times when I use the wrong verb tense, or I use the wrong word, or I misunderstand something. And I think that for me has always helped me with really trying to engage my students and try to motivate them, because I think once they realize that it's okay to like struggle a little bit, then I feel like it makes them more motivated to do better, because they're like, oh, like if I make a mistake, it's okay, I'll just do better next time.
Right, which makes it really important in the classroom for instructors or classmates not to jump on somebody for making a mistake. We're all there to learn. It's a learning community. So it has to be a safe circumstance.
Yeah, for sure.
Environment. Yeah.
Yeah. So, of course, we're socially distancing. This is a very unprecedented time, but what is something that you are enjoying during this time, despite the difficulties that we're facing?
Well, if you've ever been in my classroom, you know that my answer often comes back to food. Yeah, my husband happens to be a really great cook. He loves to cook, and I love for him to do it. And so he is getting even more motivated to have delicious food, and oftentimes things we haven't tried before. So that's one thing. I've enjoyed walks and just getting out in the fresh air as much as I can. Touching base with friends and students and colleagues. That's one way I have sanity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's probably how we're all trying to manage to stay sane. Though I could do with some more exercise and more walks. Help with the cold weather that we've been having.
Well, like the other day, I saw little snowflakes, and I was like, really? And I just said, well, that's not really out there. I just pretended. So I was kind of in my fantasy. And I just took a walk, and I thought, I'm not going to let that stop me. And then all of a sudden the sun came out, and it was really pretty. So maybe that helped.
Yeah, that's funny that you're like, I'm going to pretend this is not happening.
Yeah.
I have to do that sometimes. All right. So last question for you, Joy. What advice do you have for our students, or for anyone who's watching right now?
Oh my gosh. For students, it's a good idea to set goals. People have goals, but also have a game plan. What's your action plan? You say, you want to be better in English, for example. Well, how will you get from A to B?
Mm-hmm.
What is that going to look like? How many hours a day are you willing to study? Or what kind of help are you going to ask for? There should be some sort of specific action plan, because I think that makes it much easier to reach a goal. And in terms of anybody who's a relatively new teacher, I would advise to always be yourself when it comes to teaching, because students know if you're not being authentic. And I didn't really do that when I first started teaching. I observed other people that were, kind of strict disciplinarians and really rough, and, not rough, but, they were just really strict.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that I wasn't firm or anything like that, but I couldn't be like other people. I had to handle it my own way. So I happen to laugh a lot. So I often use humor, even though I am asking students to do what I want. Maybe, how they're acting, or maybe they're not doing something I think they should. I often use humor, but I try to use kindness, because that's who I am.
Yeah. And I think that's the most important.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Joy, so much for joining me today and for sharing. I really appreciate it.
Well, you're welcome, Lindsay.
I hope you have a wonderful day.
Well, I hope you have one as well.
All right. Thank you, Joy.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.
Bye.